Imagine waking up one day and realizing an entire branch of humanity just vanished. Not in myth, not in theory, but in cold genetic reality. No bloodlines, no graves. They were here, and then they weren't. Like a glitch in the human story. Scientists are calling it one of the most unsettling discoveries in modern archaeology. That's not a joke or a spooky legend. It's a real mystery unfolding from the high plains of Colombia, about 8,500 feet above sea level, near modern-day Bogota. Scientists recently made a stunning discovery there. They were studying ancient bones, weathered, quiet, buried for thousands of years. What they found wasn't just remarkable, it was history warping. And if you stick to the end of this video, you'll understand why some say these people didn't just vanish. They were erased. Roughly 6,000 years ago, a group of people lived in those highlands. They built fires. They crafted tools. They likely shared stories around those same fires, under a sky untouched by modern lights. And then, at some point, they vanished. Not in the way cultures slowly evolve or get absorbed. Their entire genetic lineage disappeared so thoroughly that no one alive today is even remotely related to them. Not in Colombia, not in South America, not anywhere. How's that even possible? That's what has scientists on edge. Because DNA doesn't just vanish. It's how we trace ancestry, migration, family lines. There's almost always some connection. A shared marker, a genetic thread, something. But in this case, nothing. The DNA from these ancient bones didn't match Native Americans. It didn't match anyone alive today. Not in Colombia, not anywhere. It's like their entire lineage just hit a dead end. And that right there is where our story begins. Not with what we know, but with a question. Who are these people? And how does an entire human population just vanish without a trace? Let's step into the soil of Colombia and follow the clues left behind by the oldest whisper of bones. To understand where this mystery begins, we have to go high, really high, about 2,600 meters above sea level to be exact. That's nearly 8,500 feet up in the mountains of central Colombia, where the air is thin, the nights are cold, and the past has been hiding in plain sight. The place is called the Bogota Altiplano, a wide, elevated plateau nestled between the Andean mountain ranges. Back in the day, it wasn't a forgotten backroad of history. It was a crossroads, a natural bridge between three of the most important regions of ancient America: Mesoamerica to the north, the Amazon basin to the east, and the Great Andean Highlands to the south. People passed through here, traded, settled, and left quiet traces behind. And that brings us to Chua, a small archaeological site not far from the bustling city of Bogota. At first glance, Chua doesn't look like much. A few rocks, some shell beads, maybe a fire pit or two. But buried beneath that quiet dirt were clues that would flip the entire script on who really lived here and when. Between Checwa and 4 other nearby sites, scientists uncovered the remains of 21 individuals. They weren't scattered randomly, they came from carefully excavated layers, each dated with precision. The oldest were from around 6,000 years ago, the youngest just 500 years back. That gave researchers something priceless: a timeline, a rare, unbroken glimpse at who had walked these highlands over thousands of years. And that's when things started to get weird. Because while the bones looked ordinary, the DNA told a different story. One that didn't match anyone we expected. Not the locals, not even distant relatives. What they found next would shake everything we thought we knew about the first people of the Americas. So now we've got bones, lots of them, buried in quiet Colombian soil, stretching back 6,000 years. But bones are only the beginning. What scientists really needed was a voice from the past. Not myths or guesses, but something we could measure, something solid. That's where DNA steps in. This study, published in 2025, marked the very first time ancient human DNA was successfully extracted and analyzed in Colombia. Until then, the country was a big blank spot on the ancient genetics map. Mexico had its studies, Peru had its Inca records, but Colombia, still waiting for its chapter to be told. So, researchers rolled up their sleeves and went straight for the most reliable place to find preserved DNA, the petrous part of the temporal bone. That's the dense section of skull behind your ear, and it's like a tiny time capsule. If DNA survives at all, it often survives there. They also collected teeth, which hold genetic material tucked deep in the roots. Once extracted, the genetic material was carefully cleaned, amplified, and run through global databases. And here's where it gets interesting. The scientists didn't just compare the DNA to other Colombians or neighboring groups. They compared it to thousands of ancient and modern genomes across the Americas and beyond. Think of it like trying to find a long-lost cousin at a family reunion. Only the family includes everyone from Ice Age hunters to present-day indigenous groups. The expectation? That the results would fall neatly into one of the two known Native American lineages, Northern, but this time, the results were different. Very different. And what showed up on those computer screens left the entire team in disbelief, because these people weren't part of the family tree at all. Now here's where the story takes a sharp turn. When scientists reviewed the DNA results, they weren't just looking for general patterns. They were expecting to see something familiar, either a connection to the northern Native American lineage that descended from groups like Anzac I in Montana, or the southern lineage more common in Peru, Chile, and Brazil. That's been the case with nearly every ancient DNA sample from the Americas. But these 7 individuals, the ones from the oldest layers at Chequua roughly 6,000 years ago, didn't fit. Not even close. Their DNA formed a unique genetic branch, something researchers called a basal lineage. That means their line split off early, very early, before the known Native American groups began spreading through the continent. In simple terms, they weren't part of the family reunion everyone expected. They were a branch that existed on its own, out in the quiet, never blending into the rest. This was no small difference. Genetically, these people were alone in the Americas. No connections to ancient North American ancestors, no ties to the Amazon or the Andes, no cousins in modern indigenous populations either. They lived here, yes, but as a group, they were completely genetically isolated. They were in the Americas early, possibly even among the first to settle the highlands of Colombia. But they left behind no genetic trail in the people who came after. It's like stumbling upon a forgotten room in a house you thought you'd already explored from top to bottom. No one knew this lineage even existed until their bones whispered the truth. And once heard, it raised an even bigger question. How could they be here so early and yet leave no trace at all? By this point, scientists were expecting at least some overlap. After all, when human groups settle in a place, even for a short time, they tend to leave a trace. A shared gene here, a distant cousin there, maybe even a tiny bit of blending over generations. But not these folks. The DNA results were clear. The ancient Chequua population, those 7 individuals from around 6,000 years ago, had no detectable genetic ties to the indigenous Colombians who came after them. None. Not to the groups that lived in the highlands during the later Herrera or Muisca periods. Not even to populations in nearby regions. It was a clean break, like someone had taken scissors to the family tree and snipped off an entire branch. Now, that doesn't mean they were unfriendly. We don't know how they lived, who they loved, or what relationships they had within their communities. But genetically speaking, they did not intermarry or blend in ways that passed their DNA down to later generations. If they had, even just a little, modern science would have picked up the signal. It didn't. This lack of mixing is one of the most puzzling parts of the discovery. Because in most parts of the Americas, ancient populations tend to layer on top of one another, genetically and culturally. They blend, adapt, evolve. Here, nothing. The Chequua lineage stands entirely on its own, and then disappears. It's not just that their culture faded or their artifacts were lost, it's that their entire genetic identity vanished from the human record. They were not the ancestors of anyone we know today. Not the Muisca, not neighboring Amazonian peoples, not even distant relatives hiding in the background. They came, they lived, and then they were gone. So what happened to them? This part is as unsettling as it is clear. By the time we reach around 2,000 years ago, the genetic fingerprint of the Chequua people disappears entirely from the record. Gone. Not reduced, not diluted, just absent. Scientists examined remains from later time periods, including those from the Herrera culture and the Muisca civilization, 2 well-known groups that flourished in the very same Bogota highlands. You'd expect to find at least a thread of shared ancestry, some tiny echo of that older population lingering in the bones. But there was nothing. The DNA of these later burials shows no connection to the early Chukua individuals. It's as if they never existed. Now, in most places, history tends to blur the lines. Cultures rise and fall, but genetic signals usually continue in some form. You might see blending, adaptation, or migration that softens the edges of who was who. But this was different. This was a hard reset. Imagine a relay race where one team passes the baton, except in this case, the baton vanishes halfway through the track, and a new runner shows up holding something completely different. That's what happened here. The early lineage simply stopped. No evidence of violence, no signs of conquest or disaster, just silence. And what followed wasn't a gentle handover. It was a complete population change. New people appeared in the same region, living differently, carrying different genes, speaking different languages. So now the big question is no longer just, who were they? It becomes, why did they vanish so completely? And more importantly, who replaced them? That's where the trail leads next, because what entered the scene after them changes everything all over again. Right after the Chekua lineage vanished, something new moved in, and this time, it left a lasting mark. Around 2,000 years ago, the genetic record in Colombia's highlands takes a sharp turn. New people began arriving from the north, from Central America, more specifically from areas we now call Panama and Costa Rica. These weren't just travelers passing through. They came with tools, traditions, and something that truly stood out: pottery. Yes, pottery. Simple as it may sound, ceramics were a game changer. They signaled a shift in lifestyle, from hunting and gathering to farming, storing food, trading, and building permanent communities. These new arrivals also brought with them the roots of what we now know as the Chibchan languages. These are still spoken today by some indigenous groups in Central and Northern South America, like the Bribri and the Kuna. The DNA of these newcomers shows up clearly in later remains, from the Herrera period about 2,000 years ago, and even more strongly during the Muisca era, between 1,200 and 500 years ago. Unlike the Chukua people before them, this group stayed. Their genes are still alive in the bloodlines of modern Colombians. What's fascinating is how distinct this new population was from the one that came before. They weren't descended from the Chekua people. They didn't blend with them. Instead, they replaced them, occupying the same land, but carrying entirely different ancestry. And just like that, the Bogota Highlands went from being the home of a forgotten lineage to becoming a new hub of language, farming, and long-distance cultural connections. The people had changed, the tools had changed, and history had just been rewritten again. But what caused this total handover? That's the next piece of the puzzle. So how does an entire population just vanish? And Salas win. That's the part that keeps scientists up at night. There's no clear smoking gun, no evidence of widespread conflict, no mass graves, no signs of a violent invasion. In fact, all signs point to something a bit quieter and a lot more puzzling. One theory is that the Chekua people simply dwindled over time. Small groups scattered across the highlands may have faced challenges they couldn't overcome. Fewer children, harsher seasons, dwindling resources. Bit by bit, they may have faded away. Another idea? They left, packed up and moved elsewhere. Though if that happened, they didn't leave any trace in the DNA of people beyond the region either. So if they did walk away, they took their entire lineage with them and disappeared without blending into anyone else. That's rare, very rare. There's also the possibility that they did blend, but so completely and so slowly that their unique DNA was eventually lost in the mix. Over generations, small traces might have been diluted to the point where they no longer register in the genetic record. But again, we usually see something. Here, we see nothing. And then there's the environment. The Bogota Altiplano, beautiful as it is, sits high in the Andes. Weather patterns can shift dramatically. A drop in rainfall, a long cold period, or crop failures could have tipped the balance. Meanwhile, the newcomers from Central America were bringing agriculture, ceramics, and organization. More food, more babies, more stability. So maybe it wasn't war. Maybe it was simply demographic dominance. One group outgrew the other. Slowly, peacefully, inevitably. In the end, it could be all of these things working together. A quiet ending, a slow exit, and a new story rising in its place. When you step back and look at the full picture, this discovery from the Colombian highlands teaches us more than just ancient names and dates. It opens our eyes to three powerful truths about human history and about how we study it. Lesson 1. Migration is messy. For decades, scientists believed that humans entered the Americas through a single, well-defined route, crossing from Siberia into Alaska and then branching off into North and South. Clean, simple, neat. But now, not so much. This story shows us that ancient human movement wasn't a straight line. It was a zigzag, full of starts and stops, missed turns, and forgotten paths. History didn't walk in a straight line. It wandered. Lesson 2. DNA isn't everything. Just because we don't see a genetic signature today doesn't mean those people weren't real. The Chukua population lived, breathed, built fires, raised families, and made their mark. Just not in a way that shows up in our blood. Their lives mattered, even if their genes didn't survive the long journey into modern genomes. They remind us that not every chapter gets passed down. And lesson 3, small places can hold big secrets. So the next time you hear someone talk about how it all began, remember, our history is full of gaps, twists, and surprises. And sometimes, the quietest places have the loudest stories waiting just beneath the soil. So here's where we land. A whole human group once lived in the Americas, right there in the Colombian highlands, thousands of years ago. They hunted, they gathered, they made tools, they raised children. And then, they vanished. No known descendants, no lasting legacy in the bloodlines of today. Just bones, buried quietly in the soil, holding on to a secret for 6,000 years. And that's what makes this story so powerful. These people didn't leave temples or cities, they didn't write books or carve monuments. What they left behind was far more fragile. DNA. And for a long time, even that went unnoticed. It's only now, through the lens of science, that we're hearing their story. A story not of survival, but of disappearance. And yet, it still matters. Because their absence teaches us as much as any presence could. And let's be honest, losing an entire population without a trace, that's on a whole other level. So next time you misplace your glasses, or forget why you walk into the kitchen, just smile. You may have lost your keys, but hey, you still exist. That's already more than we can say for these ancient Highlanders. Here's where you come in. What do you think happened? Were they slowly replaced? Did they move on? Or were they simply outnumbered by the tide of time? Let us know in the comments. Seriously, scientists aren't just looking at bones. They're listening to people like you. Because curiosity belongs to everyone. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And remember, sometimes the quietest voices in history leave the loudest echoes.